Have you ever wondered why sometimes you just stop feeling alive? Sometimes it's not tough to figure out. Some sections of life are just hard. But sometimes you go through stretches where you don't feel much of anything. You're not overly sad. You're not depressed, really. It's difficult to describe, but there's just a flat, gray emptiness that comes over you. You may even have a lot of the things that are supposed to make you happy. A decent job, good people around you, a routine that for the most part seems to work. But inside, you feel kind of numb and distant. You don't feel fully alive. Well, in this episode of the Discover the Word podcast, the group's going to continue a study of Acts chapter 17 in the Bible and in the events of the earliest days of the church and a speech by the Apostle Paul. We're going to find an insight, a perspective that can contribute to our becoming fully alive. Pull your chair up to the table with Daniel Ryan Day as he leads Elisa Morgan, Rasul Berry, Vivian Mabuni, and the rest of us back into Acts 17 for more about becoming fully alive here on the Discover the Word podcast. And welcome to Discover the Word and another hour of Bible engagement for life from Our Daily Bread Ministries. And this episode is part 2 of this study of Acts chapter 17. And so if you missed out on part 1, I would encourage you to go to our discovertheword.org website and listen. Becoming Fully Alive is the name of the study to look for. Now, Daniel and Elisa and Rasul and Viv are going to do a quick review of some of the highlights of part 1. But for the full study, well, you'll find that on our website. All right, so becoming fully alive. That's something we all want. And when we don't feel that way, we ask ourselves, why did I stop feeling alive? Well, there certainly are reasons that we can most likely identify. But in Acts chapter 17, we'll find a perspective that can get us back there. And so let's listen as the group refreshes our memory on some of the things we covered in episode 1. So, Daniel?
Last week I introduced you to a guy named Irenaeus quickly at the beginning.
Yes, you did.
Specifically a quote by him. He lived not too long after Paul, actually, but was a disciple of Polycarp, who was a disciple of John the Apostle. So pretty closely connected to Jesus, which is cool. Yeah. But I introduced you to a quote, and I said that somehow that was going to tie into the rest of the series, and Elisa is very skeptical of that. So, Elisa, please read what the quote was that we had and the updated version of the quote.
Okay. Irenaeus said, "The glory of God is a living man, and the life of a man consists in beholding God."
Yeah, and today, how do we kind of modernize it more?
The glory of God is a human fully alive.
Yeah. And what were some of the highlights? We're in Acts 17. What were some of the highlights that we talked about last week?
We talked about the different philosophies and theories that people had about how to be fully human and alive, from the Epicurean approach of pursuing pleasure to the Stoic approach of more of a discipline and control, and that these were the different competing ideas that existed in this marketplace of ideas in Athens that Paul was contending with. So that really stuck out to me.
And we compared them to ideas today of what would make us fully alive. We have our ideas of what it means. So you're taking us back into a dense, I guess, really interesting conversation that Paul had as he was fleeing different cities where people were kind of uprising, and he ends up in Athens.
Yeah, and the circumstances were not ideal, so fully alive isn't about having smooth sailing waters or a smooth path.
Yeah, he didn't get to Athens on a cruise ship.
Nope.
He was fleeing for his life.
We're going to see that being fully alive is living life with God. And then we kind of ended with Paul making a pretty big, maybe somewhat audacious statement. What did he say, and why was it audacious based on where he was?
Well, he was in a city full of idols, and he just explained that this unknown God that they had worshipped could not be contained in man-made temples, that he was far bigger than what people could come up with.
Right, which kind of undermines their whole temple thing. There were a bunch of temples and shrines, and he's like, the God who made everything does not live in these buildings.
And we also talked a little bit about why idols exist, right? And why are idols important in this culture, and kind of what's their approach toward idols?
Well, it was a very transactional approach and relationship, and as you said, Daniel, really well, and anybody who missed it, pick up this conversation. But, you couldn't control the weather, you couldn't predict the weather, you didn't understand how things grew. I mean, it was very much like, I'm going to make an offering to an idol, and then my crop will grow, and then I'll go out to sea and fish and have a bountiful. And, now today we know with the weather, we can track that, we know about germinating seeds, etc. But this was the way they lived.
Yeah, and there was a fickleness to the gods too. So you hoped that it was transactional.
Right.
You hoped you could honor them in such a way.
Yeah.
Yeah, but things weren't guaranteed. And so that's the context that we're in. So let's pick up and hold specifically onto that idea that we need to serve the gods to be happy. Hold on to that idea, and let's read Acts 17, verses 24 through 25.
The God who made the world and everything in it, being Lord of heaven and earth, does not live in temples made by man, nor is he served by human hands as though he needed anything, since he himself gives to all mankind life and breath and everything.
So not only does he not live in temples made by human hands, he's not served by human hands as if he needed anything.
That's such a strong statement.
Right, especially in light of understanding the context. Yeah.
Yep. And it's possible that the Epicureans are kind of nodding along a little bit at this point. There was an Epicurean from Rome named Lucretius who also said that God didn't need anything from humans. But remember, that's because they also believe that the gods weren't really involved with humans. Right? And so potentially Paul could be meeting the Epicureans still where they are a little bit, but they also would have been like, but he didn't go far enough, right? In what he said. And then this is also a pretty revolutionary, audacious statement for where they are, and specifically as it relates to kind of the common understanding of why humans were created in the first place. In the ancient Near East, there were a lot of people who believed the humans were created to serve the gods. And specifically in Greek culture, it was kind of a myth that Prometheus molded humans from water and earth, clay, so that they would populate the world and serve the gods.
Right.
And so the more you could please the gods, the more likely that your life would go better. But what does Paul say here?
He isn't served by human hands as if he needed anything.
Yeah. And this is where Paul's starting to echo some ideas from the Hebrew Bible or the Old Testament. If somebody could read Psalm 50, verse 12, we're going to see that there.
If I were hungry, I would not tell you, for the world and all that is in it is mine.
Yeah. So what's the psalmist saying God's perspective is about how much he needs humans?
Zero.
Right.
Not at all.
If I were hungry, I'm not even going to tell you because all the food is mine already.
It's all,
And so what a freeing idea here, right? You're surrounded by these idols. You're surrounded by these pictures of gods. And the whole foundational idea is that you exist to serve them. That's your whole purpose in life, to try to keep them happy. And so Paul's basically saying, like, your life is not dependent on how well you please God.
Is it fair to say in a short sentence that God doesn't need us, but he wants us?
And I think that is not only fair to say, I think it fundamentally changes the nature of the relationship. I think about it like at a wedding, right? In the Bible, it's like we're the bride. He's the groom.
Yeah.
Like the wedding is for us to come together. That's a totally different, elevated type of nature of a relationship.
Yeah. And think about just the concept of the image of God in the world. So Paul's surrounded by images of God in these shrines made by human hands. And those images require service or slavery from humans. The story that Paul has grown up believing and hearing since he was a little boy in his Jewish school and in the synagogue and over again is that he is one of the image bearers of God, that we as humans are the ones who image God. So instead of slaves or servants to an image of God, we're the very image bearers of God. So there's a way that this idol worship actually doesn't just make God look smaller, but makes humans less significant and smaller too.
That's right.
And that's what we see kind of happening here. And then you all were pulling on this thread. It says in the verse, as though he needed anything, right? Like the point isn't that God doesn't invite us into serving with him, right? Which maybe that's a better way to say it, serving with him than serving him.
Right.
He invites us to serve with him, but he doesn't need us because he's not lacking.
Yeah.
Right? He doesn't need us to feed him because he can feed himself. God's too big to fit in a building. He's too big to need us in that way. But he does invite us into serving with him. But it gets even better than that. Could someone read verse 25 again? Notice there's a little turn of phrase here I want us to see.
And he's not served by human hands as if he needed anything. Rather, he himself gives everyone life and breath and everything else.
So in a world where your purpose as a human is to give to the gods, Paul says, who's the one giving?
God gives.
God is the giver.
Yes.
So this is pretty revolutionary, right? This is taking this whole idea of why God exists, why we exist, and turning it on its head. God is the generous giver in this story.
Yeah.
God doesn't demand that we serve him. He invites us to serve with him. And unlike the many idols surrounding the people in Athens, gods who demanded service, we serve a very generous God who gives of himself sacrificially. He gives us life, gives us breath, gives us all the things that we need, ultimately giving himself, right? Which is where this whole thing started. Paul's message is about Jesus and the resurrection, right? So when we talk about becoming fully alive, we are alive because God gives us life and breath. And that's the foundational place to start as we begin to truly talk about what it means to be fully alive. God is the one who gives us life and breath in all things.
Here in part 2, we're going to get to the becoming fully alive part of the study of Acts 17. We're close to seeing how Paul works that into his speech here in Athens to all these philosophers on Mars Hill. It's a really important perspective that's bound up in the gospel. And it's just as true for us today as it was back when Paul first presented this. So good to have you here for this focus on Acts chapter 17, because the fact that you're listening to Discover the Word right now, is that an accident? You just happen to be hearing this study of Acts 17? Or is God involved in your having this conversation be part of your journey, something he's planned on using to draw you closer into relationship with him? Is it possible that God is that involved in your life? Well, we left off in that last part of the conversation with the idea that God is the giver. He's the one who ultimately gives us life and breath and all things. And so let's pick up the conversation there.
So we're in Acts 17. Let's read verses 26 and 27, if somebody could get that for us.
I would love to. These are some of my favorite verses. From one ancestor, he made all nations to inhabit the whole earth, and he allotted the times of their existence and the boundaries of the places where they would live, so that they would search for God and perhaps grope for him and find him, though indeed he is not far from each one of us.
Boy, that's a powerful translation. Perhaps grope for him and find him. It's we are in such darkness. Yeah.
That's being offered as the real purpose for why humans exist, not to serve the gods, but to find God and have a relationship with them. But we're going to hold on to that till later in the conversation. First, verse 24 earlier talked about God creating the whole world. Now, what is Paul saying that God also created?
He created the nations.
The nations.
And where they should live and what their appointed times are. So
there's a few challenges happening in this. First, Paul's talking to the Athenians, and there was a mythology, an idea that they were one of the most important people in the world, maybe the most important people in the world, because they had been made from the soil in their soil. So it's hard for us to imagine thinking that we're the most important people in the world. And so there's a little strong-handed comment here that Paul's making to this group of people, which is, I know that you all think that you're the most important, but what do we all share as humans?
Well, Paul is making the case, the same ancestor and the same source and creator.
All nations were made by God. And that term, all nations, too, is a pretty important one throughout the scriptures because it's part of how the story ends, too. So in the beginning, we have God creating the world. Then he gives Abraham a promise that what nations will be blessed through Abraham? All nations. Yep. Paul seems to be picking up on that thread here. And then where does the story end in Revelation?
All nations.
All nations.
Every tribe, tongue, and nation bound before the throne.
Yeah. Why is it important for us as we think about what it means to be a Christian, what it means to be fully alive, what it means to be in this world, to be reminded that we're all part of the same human race?
Yeah.
I think that it definitely, especially when you look at the history of humanity, we tend to be ethnocentric. The way that my people do things, our particular contributions to the world are the most important. And you can fill in the blank with any type of nationalism or ethnocentrism that you can, and it always ends badly because that's an idol that we replace the image of God for. So if we're made in the image of God, then that means everybody has shared in that image equally. And that also means that we have to direct our attempts to find him and connect and flourish and thrive and improve ourselves, not on our ethnic pride, but on our relationship to God.
And so that's one of the challenges that Paul's drawing out here is the Athenians believed that they were extra special because they sprouted from their own soil. Ethnocentrism. Rasul, thanks for using that word. And we still struggle with the same thing today, right? So there's something here for us to think about. The second challenge in this passage is, remember the Epicureans? What did they believe about God being involved or not involved?
Uninvolved.
Uninvolved.
Right.
Yeah.
And what does Paul say? How involved is God in this section?
He's created us, given us breath, everything else, but also determined boundaries of where we're going to live. So that's not just like, it's been he's very involved down to, okay, this is where you're going to be born. This is what region of the world, this is what time you're going to be born in.
Yeah.
So history is in God's hands. Creation is in God's hands, and he is very involved.
Yeah.
So the Epicureans at this point are probably like, wait a second. What are you saying? And remember, what is he fleshing out? He honored them. He met them where they are by saying he's going to describe what God?
Their unknown God.
Their unknown God. And so Paul's beginning to build this argument of this unknown God that you had is the creator of all things, the creator of all people.
Yeah.
He doesn't live in a temple made by human hands. He doesn't need you to serve him because he's not lacking in anything, and he is super involved in history. That's the kind of the case that's being made.
Yeah.
So pause for a second. If it's true that God is the God of all history, what implications does that have for us as we think about election cycles or whatever?
Oh, he's already designed who's going to be where and what's going to happen.
And I know there's people that are going to hear this who are either excited about what happened last November or completely devastated by what happened. And here we have some encouragement that regardless of what happened last November,
or next November, or the
next election or whatever, God is the God of all history. And he's still working his purposes, whether we really sense him or not.
The thing I love about you bringing that up is that we hold together two realities. We can trust God. We should trust God that he is sovereign and over the affairs of human history. And yet at the same time, it says here in verse 27 that they should seek God and perhaps feel their way toward him and find him, so that there's human activity that God is still requiring and expecting of us. So this doesn't get us off the hook to say, well, since he's sovereign, then I shouldn't care about anything that's happening socio-politically or in civic engagement. No, still show up, you know what I mean? But show up without a sense of fear and show up without a sense of omnisignificance that, of what my showing up is contributing to this process.
Yeah. And I know there's a lot of people that listen to us from outside the U.S.
Right.
And so the same message is true there as well.
Mm-hmm.
Our hope is not dependent on who's in power in whatever country we're a part of.
Right.
And again, to your point, Rasul, you're starting to push us toward the purpose that we see for humans in this passage, which is what?
You mean verse 27? That they should seek God and perhaps feel their way toward him and find him, yet he is actually not far from each one of us.
Yeah. So going back, Elisa, I think you were the one that drew this out in an earlier conversation. We would maybe update this language, modernize it to have a relationship with God. That's the purpose of humans. That's why we exist. What jumps out to you about the way it says that we search for God?
Oh, that groping.
Yeah.
That was just so powerful.
Yeah, and when we think about like a word like that, do you picture a brightly lit room or darkness. Or right?
Darkness.
Yeah.
It's like when
It's
you're
like trying to find the bathroom light,
Yes.
in the middle of the night.
Yeah, or wear your shirt inside out.
Yeah.
and try to dress in the dark.
Yeah.
I've done that.
Yeah.
And I think there's a certain humility that insight is giving, so that Paul isn't attacking them. He's just saying, hey, we're all on this journey trying to figure out who God is. And of course, no one would know that better than Paul himself, who was feeling his way toward God, but got it wrong, got the shirt and the pants completely, inside out, and was like, oh, the person that I was thinking I was defending, I was actually persecuting.
Right.
Yeah.
And so I think there's a certain grace that he's extending to them that's a reflection of his own story.
Yeah.
You know what else I love is in verse 26 and talking about how he marked out appointed times in history and the boundaries of their land so that they would seek him and perhaps reach out and find him. I mean, he's talking to the Athenians, and it's like, you, right here. I appointed you to be here at this moment, to be here as I'm speaking, so that you might find me.
Yeah.
And it's so personal.
Yeah.
I've often heard being fully alive described as being fully present in the present moment with God. Which is exactly what we see kind of fleshing out here. This idea that we're with God in this moment and that God wanted us in this moment so that what?
We would find
would
him.
grope and find him.
Yep. And it sounds like it's going to be difficult, right? It doesn't sound like it's going to be easy at times. It's going to feel like trying to find your way through the dark as we seek out God.
But isn't it so good to know that he's not far from us?
Exactly.
And that's the hope.
And the fact that God is near. The Bible talks about this in other ways. It talks about nothing can separate us from the love of God.
That's right.
It says, I will never leave you or forsake you. Right? There's other ways the Bible says this. And that's really what I think is some of the best news in this whole section, is the fact that God is so close. All you have to do is reach out and you'll find that he's there. So when you make mistakes and sin, God doesn't leave you. He's right there to find forgiveness and grace. If you don't know him yet, guess what? He's right there. Reach out for him and find him. And the people that Paul's speaking to right now are in that group. They don't know him yet.
Right.
God's not far away from you. He's right there. He wants to have a relationship with you. And that's the case that we're getting to see for what it looks like to be fully alive or fully present with God in the present moment right now, finding out that he's right here.
All right, and so that brings us to the place where Paul is going to talk about this perspective that we've said was coming of why we are fully alive when we have a relationship with God through Jesus. All this background and context of the situation described in Acts 17 has brought us to this point in Paul's speech where he will roll out the idea that our quote from the early church father Irenaeus that we began the study with in episode 1, where that's based on, that the glory of God is a human fully alive. And so, we're almost halfway through the second hour of this study, and the group, especially Elisa, back in part 1, started wondering when we're going to get to the becoming fully alive part of Acts 17.
So this series is about becoming fully alive.
We were going to talk about that.
So I've heard.
Well, in this next segment, Daniel at last will say,
it's finally time to get to the clearest statement about becoming fully alive from Paul. You ready?
Yeah, of course we are. But first, let's take a short break. Now, as we continue discussing what it means to become fully alive, I also want to take about 60 seconds to remind you about Reclaim Today. Now, Reclaim Today is an aspect of our ministry here at Our Daily Bread Ministries that reaches out specifically to people in their 20s and 30s. Daniel leads this team, and they provide biblical content that helps young adults connect with God in the ordinary, everyday moments of their life. He and his team offer encouraging resources like prayers, scripture meditations, devotions, articles, and some really good material on spiritual habits. It's pretty obvious that different generations communicate differently, right? I mean, that's always been the case. And so Reclaim Today really focuses on how millennials and Gen Z and younger think about living out their faith. I hope you'll explore their website to see some of the great things they're doing at reclaimtoday.org. And if you're not in that age demographic, that you'll refer someone you know who is to the site. Again, that's at reclaimtoday.org. And we'll also have a link to Reclaim Today's site in our show notes. All right, so finally, we are getting to the part of the Apostle Paul's speech in Athens in which he introduced a group of philosophers he was debating there on Mars Hill to the perspective that holds the key to becoming fully alive. Their philosophies had them looking for life in so many other places, just like we often are looking for life in other places. But Paul so winsomely rolls out the gospel, the good news about Jesus, to them. And in the process, gives us a perspective that can change our lives as well. And so let's listen for what Elisa and the rest of us have been waiting for. Daniel?
It's finally time to get to the clearest statement about becoming fully alive.
The clearest statement.
From Paul.
Okay.
You ready? Could someone read Acts 17:28, which is what Paul says next?
Okay. For in him we live and move and have our being, as even some of your own poets have said, for we too are his offspring. And that makes us fully alive. Wait, no, those words aren't there. Wait, no, they're nowhere there.
I know. I said at the beginning that there was a quote by a guy named Irenaeus.
Okay.
And I was curious if his quote that was really meaningful to me, that the glory of God as a human fully alive, if we can see things like that in Scripture.
Yeah.
And I think we see it here. Because in him we what?
Live and move
and
have our being.
Right?
Yeah.
So in him we are alive.
Yeah.
And we live. And we keep existing.
Okay.
And this is surprising in many ways for Paul to say this because he's not quoting the Hebrew Bible or Old Testament here. He's not quoting Jesus, not quoting one of the apostles. He's not even quoting a rabbi or another Jewish leader that he grew up with. Who does Paul say this idea or these ideas came from?
The actual text says, as one of your own poets have said.
Oh,
Yeah.
one of your own. Okay.
So if we were going to modernize this, it'd be like a line from the Beatles ending up in the Bible. But there's potentially two lines here from poets that they would have been familiar with. The first quote is potentially from a Cretan philosopher named Epimenides. The second quote could also be Epimenides potentially, but it's currently tracked back to Aratus from Sicily. And we're going to look at these quotes in a little more detail. So here's the larger quote by Epimenides. This is from the poem Cretica, and is the words of Minos, who's Zeus's son, talking about his dad Zeus. Okay, so here's the longer quote. They fashioned a tomb for thee, O holy and high one. The Cretans, always liars, evil beasts, idle bellies. Ouch. But thou art not dead. Thou livest and abidest forever, for in thee we live and move and have our being. What is surprising about Paul quoting that poem in this setting?
I think just in general, it's surprising that Paul quotes a secular poem. I mean, we have very, very few references in Scripture that are quoted outside of Scripture. I mean, you have a lot of quotes from the Hebrew Bible, the Old Testament, and the New Testament, but only a couple of times do we see like a secular hymn or a quote from a philosopher.
Yeah. And what's the poem describing? Who is it
Zeus.
describing?
It's describing Zeus.
So he's describing the Greek king of gods, king of the gods, Zeus. So what do we do with something like this, where we are reading through the scriptures and we get to a quote that's about a different God, but attributed to God? Does that make anybody feel uncomfortable?
I guess it depends on what the quote is.
Yeah. Do we have any modern ways that we do similar things, where we use something that maybe wasn't originally for God, but use it to describe God in some way?
I think so. I think that if you think about like a sermon where someone may reference, for example, Aretha Franklin and saying, RESPECT, find out what it means, and then turn that and say, we are to respect God or our elders. And so kind of connecting a poet and some theme that emerged in reality or society, and then connecting that to a spiritual theme. I think that's something we actually do pretty regularly.
Yeah. And why do we do that?
I think taking something familiar and that is kind of an understood truth and attaching that to a deeper spiritual truth seems to just make sense to us.
And I think it's knowing your audience, because if I'm speaking at a girls' junior high group and I mention Taylor Swift lyrics and I talk about, that invisible string that ties me to you, they're like totally tracking like, oh, I get it now.
So maybe it's not as uncomfortable as we think, right? Has Bill Crowder ever quoted the Beatles on Discover the Word, teaching about God?
Maybe once, maybe twice. Yeah.
So this is Paul meeting his audience where they are. Has he done this before?
Yes.
And although Epimenides may have been thinking about Zeus when he wrote those words, he actually accurately described the unknown God, and Paul just wants them to know that it wasn't Zeus, it was this God instead, right? So let's look at the other poetic line now. So here's the larger quote by Aratus. It is with Zeus that every one of us in every way has to do, for we are also his offspring. So same question as the last one. Should this make us feel uncomfortable that we see this quote from a secular guy, but being attributed to God?
No, I think it makes great sense. Appreciate so much this context.
And I think there's a phrase that I've heard before that I think is really helpful. All truth is God's truth.
That's exactly what I was thinking.
And this idea that I don't have to limit God to only the revelation that he has revealed in the Bible. Like he didn't limit himself to that. In fact, he says in Psalm 19, the heavens declare the glory of God, the earth, the firmament. He's saying like, look around you, that even in the natural revelation of creation, it says it sings and it preaches of him. So if that is true of just rocks and animals in the sky, how much more can we have that as something we can draw from, especially if we're helping people to connect it to a greater, deeper truth.
Yeah. How would Paul have known about this poet? How did the story start? Paul got irritated. He saw the city was full of idols. And then what was he doing?
He walks around
He's
and
walking around
studies
doing
them.
what? Studying. Carefully paying attention, right? So this is just another layer of Paul doing what we do sometimes when we teach or when we have sermons or whatever, meeting people where they are, right? Honoring the cultural terms that they might be familiar with, using those terms so that they might remember an idea or hold on to it. And then Paul just said something similar to offspring in the verses right before this. What was our previous conversation about who made the world and all the people
in it?
God. From one man, every nation of mankind to live on the earth. And so that particular point of reference, that we are indeed his offspring, is a natural outgrowth of a very biblical vision of the fact that God made us in his image, and indeed would, then talk about us as children of God.
And so I think this is where we start to see more of the apologetic side of Paul. And it's kind of like Paul saying, you all think Zeus is the one with whom you live and move and have your being, but actually it's this unknown God that I'm telling you about, right? You think that you have this special offspring because you sprouted out of the ground in Athens and Zeus is your God, but actually we're this unknown God's offspring. So he's beginning to subvert these messages, but by first meeting them where they are. So he's building his case. He's meeting them where they are. He started by honoring their intentionality with their worship.
Yeah.
He started by mentioning the altar to the unknown God. And he began to confront some of their ideas about whether it was the Epicureans or the Stoics, about how involved God is in history, about how God's right there with them. All they have to do is reach out. And then he just does that again by meeting them where they are with this quote. And I think this is really important for us because sometimes as Christians, we talk a lot about the need to escape our culture.
Right.
As if it's a bad thing, like we need to get out of this. But Paul's kind of modeling the opposite.
Yeah, God can use anything. In fact, he does use our culture. Yeah.
And Jesus did the same thing, where he would constantly point whose coin, again, going back to the money.
Yeah. Whose inscriptions on
the coin. Give to Caesar what is Caesar's, gives to God the things that are God. One last thing that I wanted to draw out. I think the word that, or whatever in your translation, the starting point of verse 27 is doing a lot of heavy lifting here, because Paul has said that God has determined where we would live. He's made everybody. And then in my version in 27 says that they should seek God and perhaps find him. And then this quote comes, that is saying purpose. This is why, God has created mankind and has put us where we are when we are, that they should seek God, find him, and in doing so, find that we live and move and have our being and our fullest selves in him as well.
Yeah, that's when we're most fully alive. When we realize that in him we live and move and have our being. That relationship with God through Jesus is the key to becoming fully alive. Daniel Ryan Day, Elisa Morgan, Rasul Berry, and Vivian Mabuni studying through Acts chapter 17 together with you. And now let's take time to break down those three aspects of that statement. In him we live and move and have our being. Those three things that are components of a life being lived fully alive.
So we just learned these phrases from a secular Cretan philosopher named Epimenides. I want to pull these apart and look at these because I think they're a little different, each of them. So first, let's read Acts 17:28 again, and then let's look at the phrases, if somebody could get that for us.
For in him we live and move and have our being, as even some of your own poets have said, for we too are his offspring.
So those three phrases, in him we live and move and have our being. Are those three ways of saying the same thing? Are they a little different? What do you hear?
I hear different things.
Okay.
Because I think the live and move are kind of different in the sense that the moving kind of, to me, especially in light of in verse 26 where it says determine the allotted periods and boundaries of dwelling place. So when I hear move, I kind of hear like God, this aspect of speaking to a God who's not just limited to Athens. He's not just limited to Greece, but this is a God who has no limits or boundaries.
That's right.
In fact, he actually prescribes the boundaries of where we can go.
So location.
Yes. So I think a location when I think of move, and then versus live is kind of this statement of our presence with God, even if we don't see it, right? Because he's saying like he's not far from us. So in him we live.
Yeah. And I think live is more like our everyday life, the things that we're doing. Like we are having a conversation, and we even talk about living in the moment. So there's a sense of a presence when I think of live.
I'm glad you feel like there's a difference, because I thought there was too, and I thought we would spend a conversation talking about it. So if you guys had said no, there's no difference. Well, okay. So let's flesh each of these out. So in him we live. The word there is talking about to be alive, to live your life.
Fully alive?
Fully alive, maybe even. What does living consist of?
Like breathing, eating, sleeping,
going to work,
working.
This reminds me a lot of Colossians 3:17.
Yes.
If somebody could read that for us.
Sure, I'll read that.
Good.
And whatever you do, whether in word or deed, do it all in the name of the Lord Jesus, giving thanks to God the Father through him.
Yeah. I really like how Eugene Peterson paraphrases this. Could somebody look up in the Message Colossians 3:17?
Yeah, I got it. Let every detail in your lives, words, actions, whatever, be done in the name of the Master, Jesus, thanking God the Father every step of the way.
So where is God when we're doing all the things that we do?
With us.
With us.
Mm-hmm.
Which is kind of what Paul was already saying when he said he's not far from any
Right.
one of us, right? He's right there. And so is there anything in our lives that we do in living that is outside of God's care or his notice or his attention?
No, not in actuality, but it can be in our awareness, which is have our being.
Yeah.
I think is the difference there.
Unpack that a little more.
Right. So in him we live, we exist,
Yes.
move, we go about our day and go about our life in transit all over. Have our being to me is like, this is more of the like conscious awareness of ourself in the context of who God is. That's
Yeah.
how I read that.
Yeah.
Well, and there is a way in which we can step outside of the relationship when we sin, when we make choices against him.
And if we step away from him, it doesn't mean he steps away from us.
Exactly.
Right? So I want to kind of like maybe update this a little bit. And by updated, I don't mean change what's in the Bible,
Okay.
but help us capture that nuance there. I almost wonder if what Paul's saying here is with him we live. Instead of in him, with him we live, which the word could be translated either way. So it's like with him we go through all the things that we're doing on a daily basis, eating, drinking, working, doing all the things.
Yeah.
With him
With
we
him.
live. So what would the next one be?
And
And
with him
move.
we
With
move.
him we
Yeah,
move.
Okay.
Any guesses as to what the Greek word means here?
For move.
Yeah, it means to move.
I thought it was go.
Meaning motion, to
I've
move
got
around.
something with travel too.
Yep.
When I looked it up,
There
change
are,
location.
yeah, to change location. It can also be kind of like to shake or to stir up, to be moved.
Oh, okay.
This is a very action-oriented word.
Yeah. Yeah.
So let's brainstorm all the ways that we move in a day.
How many steps? Let me pull up my
I
app.
know.
Okay,
Oh.
so walking, running,
Yeah.
yep.
Walking,
Yeah.
running.
Standing, sitting.
Standing, sitting,
Breathing.
yep. What about typing, working out, laying down, taking a shower, cooking,
Eating.
recording radio shows?
Walking
It's
your
all
dog.
moving, yeah.
Yep. This one reminds me a lot of Psalm 1 through 2, which also has a lot of movement language,
Oh,
but
it
it's the
does.
opposite, right? So could someone read Psalm 1 through 2 with us?
Sure, I've got that. Blessed is the one who does not walk in step with the wicked, or stand in the way that sinners take, or sit in the company of mockers, but whose delight is in the law of the Lord, and who meditates on his law day and night.
So a lot of movement in that verse 2, but the exact opposite of the type of movement that Paul's talking about, right? So where's God when we move from one thing to another?
With us.
Yeah, where's God when you sit down after a long day or in the middle of a long day?
Still with us.
He's still
Yeah.
with us. Where's God when you lay down or take a nap?
He is with us.
With us still.
So is there any movement in a day that goes outside of God's notice or care?
No.
So with him we live, with him we move. What's next?
Have our being.
With him we have our
Yeah,
being.
with him we have our being. And the Greek word there literally means to exist or to be present. The first two phrases are more action-oriented, so living, moving, doing things. This is more passive, that we just exist. We're just here because God made us. Where earlier in this passage did Paul say something similar about God?
Oh, just up a little bit. It's in verse 26. From one man he made all nations. Is that
Yep.
what you're thinking of? And then he goes down and talks about we're his offspring in verse 28.
Yep. What about the end of verse 25?
And he's not served by human hands as if he needed anything. Rather, he himself gives everyone life and breath and everything else.
Yeah, so he literally gives us our existence.
Yeah, he's our source.
So when we go around and live our lives, he's with us and he cares about us. When we're moving around and doing things, he cares for us and is with us. And the very fact that we exist means that he's with us.
It's very Adamic, if you will. You know, from one man he made all, that all should inhabit. But then seeing that he gives everyone life and breath, and you just, You just imagine him breathing life in.
But there's also this other part where he's talking about that in verse 27, that we should seek God and perhaps feel or grope our way toward him. So there's still this aspect where it's not enough just to say, oh, okay, so God is with me all the time, that I don't have to do anything. It's like, well, no, I think to fully be alive, we need to move toward God and be more conscious of his presence with us in order to fully access it and appreciate it and appropriate it for our lives.
Yeah, and I think that's what we're kind of driving at the idea of that to be fully alive is to be fully present with God in the present moment.
Right.
How good are we at being present in the present moment?
I'll speak for myself.
That's
it's
a
tough.
challenge.
Right?
It really is. It's a challenge.
Yeah, and so to the point, Rasul, that you're making, and Elisa, you're kind of drawing out, we do have responsibility there of also leaning back into God in the moment with us. But I also think there is some really good news here for, like, I think of the mom that feels like her kids always get in the way of her being able to have a quiet time with God. Where's God when she's taking care of her kids and doesn't feel like she has any time?
Already there.
With her as she's living and moving and having her being.
Yeah,
or,
that's right.
you know, we have so many civil service people in our world who work overnight.
Right.
Whether to rescue people, to keep them safe, whatever it is. When they decide the next day, I'm going to spend some time with God before I fall asleep after I just got off at 7:30 a.m. And they fall asleep instead, and they're all disappointed in themselves because they didn't spend time with God. Well, where was God that night when they were serving others? He was with them as they lived and moved and had their being. And so I think what I see in this is that God doesn't ask us to step out of our lives to meet with him. God wants to live life with us. Sometimes this means spending intentional time with him when we have that space, praying, reading the scriptures. But this also means that every moment of every day is an invitation into a deeper relationship with God. And I think that's really, when we start thinking about what it means to be fully alive, it's being fully present in the present moment with God, whether we're super busy or we have space to be more intentional, because in him we live and in him we move and in him we have our being.
Yeah, that statement from Paul there in Athens, that in him we live and move and have our being, and the relationship with God through Jesus that it refers to, that's the key to becoming fully alive. It's a message that speaks to us in our world today with amazing relevance, doesn't it? And so, where are you in this whole discussion? Do you identify with those in the story who don't really buy into this life with God through Jesus? Or are you curious, kind of feeling like you're groping around in the dark, hoping to find God? Or does this remind you of what you believe and why you can feel fully alive? Well, the conclusion of our study, Becoming Fully Alive, here on Discover the Word. We'll follow this quick look ahead to where the group goes for their next study.
Do you ever read the Gospels and run across what seems like a completely impossible command from Jesus and think, how am I supposed to do that?
Absolutely.
Yeah?
I'm trying to think of any commands that Jesus gives that I'm like, that's easy. Because if you think through even just the Sermon on the Mount, a lot of them are pretty hard. Love your enemies.
Well, I got an easy one. If your eye causes you to sin, pluck it out.
There you go.
Yeah.
Sometimes when I read, I think, this is absolutely ridiculous. How in the world am I supposed to do these things? And it intrigued me. So we're going to do a series of conversations on seemingly impossible commands. And, the question we start with is, would God give us impossible commands and expect us to keep them?
That's the direction that Elisa will be taking us for our next Discover the Word podcast, a 2-episode study of those seemingly impossible commands here on the Discover the Word podcast. Well, it sure has been good to have you as part of the group for these 2 episodes that we've been in Acts chapter 17. I think it's been a great example of why engaging Scripture together in community is such an effective and transformative way to do that. So, Daniel, let's wrap this up.
Let's close out our discussion on becoming fully alive by seeing how the story ends. So we finally got to Elisa's stuff that she wanted to get to, where
lots of
Paul
Elisa's
describes
stuff. Yep.
what it means to be alive.
Yes.
And let's see how his speech ends and kind of how the story ends. So could someone read Acts 17, verses 29 through 34?
Being then God's offspring, we ought not to think that the divine being is like gold or silver or stone, an image formed by the art and imagination of man. The times of ignorance God overlooked, but now he commands all people everywhere to repent, because he has fixed a day on which he will judge the world in righteousness by a man whom he has appointed. And of this he has given assurance to all by raising him from the dead. Now when they heard of the resurrection of the dead, some mocked, but others said, we will hear you again about this. So Paul went out from their midst, but some men joined him and believed, among whom also were Dionysius the Areopagite and a woman named Damaris, and others with them.
Yeah, so that's how our story ends. Let's just go maybe verse by verse kind of through it. So let's start with verse 29. Lisa, you could reread just that one verse for us.
Since we are God's offspring, we ought not to think that the deity is like gold or silver or stone, an image formed by the art and imagination of mortals.
Yeah. So for me, we're finally getting to what I expected Paul to say.
Right.
But it's at the end.
Yeah.
After he's met them where they are, after he's honored them.
It's got their attention.
Right.
And he's built this case.
Right.
Yeah. And what's kind of some of the argument he's made for why an idol would be inadequate to capture?
Well, it can't contain God.
Can't contain God. He's
And
too
it's
big.
made by a person.
It's made by a person and we're made by God. Right? So what does Paul maybe suggest is a more accurate picture of who God is that will remind us a lot of the beginning of the Bible in Genesis? We are God's what?
Image.
And then Paul's been building a case about one particular altar, which is which God is
The unknown God.
Yeah,
the unknown God. And then he's quoted references to other gods, like a couple quotes about Zeus, and applied them to who?
God.
And then also,
God.
So I guess when he says the image of art in the imagination of man, that might be a subtle way of going back to the second commandment, right? Of like, you should not have an graven image of me, because even if you make him with a beard or without a beard, or, then it's still in your imagination.
And there's been controversy in the church since the beginning of what images can or can't be made.
That's right.
To represent the story or represent who God is. Can we have any representation of the Trinity that's physical, or are we supposed to only think about that and believe in it instead, right? Those controversies have gone through all of church history.
Yeah.
But I think what Paul's been doing a little bit here is he's been reminding us that when we make an idol, we make God smaller than he is. It's inadequate representation of who God is.
That's right.
Right.
And when we make an idol, we make us less than we are. Because we're God's image bearers. We're his offspring.
Right.
So idol worship actually hurts our picture of God.
Yeah.
And it hurts our picture of ourselves.
Wow.
Our purpose is tied to finding God and having a relationship with him. But the ancient gods, the human's purpose was to be a slave to the gods. So when we make an idol and serve it, we're actually hurting our own image of ourselves.
Right. And if that is true for a physical manifestation, how much more is that even true for the non-physical idols, things that we put in place of God in our life, whether that's career. Now I have lost my family because I work all the time, or whether that is vanity and, whatever it is, seeking pleasure like the Epicureans and, all of these things, and which maybe is why in verse 30, you start to see elements of God being like, okay, the times of ignorance God overlooked in the past, but now he commands all people everywhere to repent.
Yeah. Stop following the gods of the marketplace and start following this God now, right?
Yeah.
So Paul's starting to really increase
Yes.
the flame a little bit here, right? It's starting to heat up. Now, sometimes we think language like repent is judgmental, is harsh, but based on what we've seen, the argument that Paul's building, that it denigrates our image of God, it makes us less than we are. There's almost a compassion to repenting here.
Change your mind.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Change the direction you're going in.
And so by repenting, by stopping the worship of idols and following the unknown God, the picture of this unknown God starting to get more and more clear as Paul goes, by stopping the worship of idols and following the real God instead, we're leaving behind something that's fake, right? Something that makes God look smaller, something that diminishes God, something that dehumanizes the humans that are worshiping these idols. And this is why repenting for them would have been really good news, right? Actually, is the fact, this is what makes it gospel, good news, is the fact that you're actually becoming more human, stepping more into who God created you to be by letting go of these idols and worshiping God.
And thus more fully alive.
And there you go. Ding, 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 ding.
And so that's what we're starting to see. So Irenaeus' quote, right? The glory of God is a human fully alive. By living into being fully alive, it also means that we're showing the world who God is more, right? Because we're being the image of God. And it also means that we're becoming more alive as we learn more what it means to walk through life with God. And who does Paul say is going to judge the world in this? Who's Paul talking about here?
Jesus.
Jesus, yeah. And in what will Jesus judge the world? What does it say there?
In righteousness.
In righteousness. Yeah, we've talked about righteousness before on Discover the Word quite a bit. And it's a little different when it applies to God versus us, or when it applies to Jesus versus us. When it applies to Jesus and God, it's like, yeah, he always does what's right. He is right. He's good. He's just. He does what's right. For us, it's more in right relationship with the God who is right.
Yeah.
And so it's really good news that Jesus would be the judge in righteousness, because it means it'll be perfect and it'll be good and it'll be what's right. And how can we be confident that Jesus will be able to do this?
He has given this assurance to us all by raising him from the dead.
Yeah. And if God is powerful enough to raise Jesus from the dead, that's a pretty good deposit to know that God's going to keep his promises and make all things right too.
Yeah.
Which is pretty great news. Now, there's 3 responses that we see, right? What are the three ways that people responded to this message?
Some just went, yeah, right. They sneered in my translation, or scoffed.
Mine says mocked.
Mocked.
So there was a few that called him a babbler early on that probably are still calling him a babbler, a guy who finds ideas and passes them off as his own, but doesn't really know what he's talking about. But some...
They're curious. So we'd like to hear from you again about this.
Yeah.
And I think I've learned in my own approaches to sharing my faith to allow space.
That's good.
I'd like to hear more about this.
Yeah. And then there's one more group.
They believe.
Yeah.
Joined
Dionysius,
in and believed. Yeah.
The Areopagite. And that should jump out at us, because where are we when Paul's doing the speech?
In the Areopagus.
Areopagus,
Easy
right?
for you to say.
Right, so it's he's in this space where it's like the council, the place where they would have trials of this sort. So he's one of the members, maybe.
That's a big deal.
Yep, so that's kind of a big deal. And a woman named Damaris. And throughout Luke's gospel, throughout Acts, Luke often draws attention to the fact that this was not just something for men.
Right.
But women were also invited in as participants and members of this church community as Jesus' disciples and followers, those types of things. And so we see him doing what he does throughout the gospel here as well.
And then a number of others.
Yeah.
And a number of others as well. And so I would invite all of us just to think about, where are we in this, right? Do we hear this invitation from God to be fully alive, and it's hard for us to believe that's true? Maybe we're in a season where we feel like we're groping around in the darkness, wanting it to be true. And we're just like, God, where are you? Why are you not here? So many of us find ourselves in that spot as well. I think Irenaeus, who we talked about a few times, and specifically here, Paul, is offering us a choice, right? We're walking around in the marketplace of ideas every day, bombarded with ideas about what it means to live the good life, to be alive. And Paul's reminding us, Irenaeus is reminding us, that the glory of God is a human fully alive.
Yeah.
And sometimes the things that we pursue are actually self-destructive.
Yeah.
And the things we think we most want are actually the things that dehumanize us and make us less than human. But God lives life with us.
That's right.
He isn't far off asking us to step out of our lives to find him. He's near and inviting us to live life with him and to become fully alive along the way.
Daniel, thanks for leading us in this study of Acts chapter 17, Becoming Fully Alive. And the glory of God is a human fully alive. I hope that idea and that perspective and that way of living life has become even more clear to you. And whichever spot you're in, that Daniel mentioned there, that corresponds with the people in this story from the earliest days of the church, I hope our time together on Discover the Word has been an encouragement to you. Thanks for being in your spot here at the table alongside Daniel and Elisa Morgan and Rasul Berry and Vivian Mabuni. Discover the Word is a small group Bible study from Our Daily Bread Ministries in Grand Rapids, Michigan, in which we invite you to walk with us through topics and passages that inform the way we read the Scriptures, challenge us as we live our lives as followers of Christ, and always point us to discover Jesus in the pages of the Bible. And we are honored to be able to open the Scriptures together with you here on Discover the Word. One listener recently messaged us and said, "Listening to a group converse in words that are easily understood makes the Bible come alive, making me feel as if I'm in the study with them." And that's because actually you are in the study with them. You're part of the group. And you can help us share the life-changing story and wisdom of the Bible with others by making a one-time donation or by becoming a monthly partner and giving a recurring gift every month. If you'd like to partner with us financially, then visit discovertheword.org and look for the donate button that's up at the top of the page. That's at discovertheword.org. Thanks. And thanks for listening. I'm Brian Heading at Discover the Word.